Hello Internet, I'm Jackie Fox, and today I'm going to show you the 1800s as your history teachers didn't as we look at the history of socialism in America. One of the initial challenges the first American socialists faced was the institution of slavery. This is not to say that all abolitionists were socialist, but this was the issue that America's first self-proclaimed socialists would fight. It was a crucial moment for socialism, a concept that had only been born that century. Slavery is the epitome of everything a socialist opposes, and the movement would have proven itself to be morally bankrupt if it had not fought against the enterprise, since even before its inception through people like Thomas Paine. If slavery was a moral test of socialism, then abolition was verification that socialism could change the foundations of society, and that perhaps a more just and equal world was possible. Even in the early formation of the Republican Party as a primarily abolitionist organization, there were numerous social democrats and outright socialists among them. There was a strange time in American socialist history where socialists met under the banner of Abraham Lincoln, their championed great emancipator. Socialists had been so influential in this pursuit that it's thought perhaps the great right-wing American tradition of denouncing all opposition as socialist had its origins among slave-holding elites. Former Vice President John C. Calhoun made the connection between the criticism of slavery to the criticism of capital as early as 1836. A very slight modification of the arguments used against the institutions which sustain the property and security of the South would make them equally effectual against the institutions of the North, including banking, which in so vast an amount of property and capital is invested. Virginia Senator Robert M.T. Hunter, March 25, 1850, also recognized this connection. Mr. President, if we allow no law as obligatory and no government as legitimate which authorizes involuntary servitude, we shall be forced to consign the world to anarchy, for no government has yet existed which did not recognize and enforce involuntary servitude for other causes than crime. To destroy that, we must destroy all inequality in property, for as long as these differences exist, there will be an involuntary servitude of man to man. Your socialist is the true abolitionist, and he only fully understands his mission. Jefferson Davis, on the eve of the Civil War, agreed. In fact, the European socialists, who, in wild radicalism, are the correspondents of the American abolitionists, maintained the same doctrine as to all property that the abolitionists do to slave property. He who has property, they argue, is the robber of him who has not. Le property, c'est le vol, is the famous theme of the socialist Proudhon. And the same precise theories of attack at the North on the slave property of the South would, if carried out to their legitimate and necessary logical consequences, and will, if successful in this, see first state of action superinduce attacks on all property, North and South. Which is a very old historical use of the slippery slope argument, and also threatening me with a good time. It may not be well known in history books today, but as these quotes illustrate, the slave-owning oligarchy of the time knew about it all too well. John Brown was one of the most famous of the abolitionists, and it's easy to see why. On trial for attempting to incite a slave insurrection in Harper's Ferry, he said this in his speech to the court: "I believe that to have interfered as I have done in behalf of his despised poor is no wrong, but right. Now, if it is deemed necessary that I shall forfeit my life for the furtherance of the ends of justice, and mingle my blood with the blood of millions in this slave country whose rights are disregarded by wicked, cruel, and unjust enactments, I say, let it be done." After the trial, he was hung and his body dissected. Upon his arrest, Brown told his captors, "I want you to understand that I respect the rights of the poorest and weakest of colored people oppressed by the slave system just as much as I do those of the wealthy and powerful." In many northern communities on the day of Brown's execution, church bells tolled, guns fired solemn salutes, ministers preached sermons of commemoration, and thousands sat, bowed in silent reverence for this martyr of liberty. One journalist wrote, "A feeling of deep and sorrowful indignation seems to possess the masses. He had been an abolitionist for 20 years before being executed as an insurrectionist. John Brown is the one person on this list that would be as much within the revolutionary tradition as Thomas Paine. One of Brown's contemporaries was Frederick Douglass, an American social reformer, abolitionist, orator, writer, and statesman. After escaping slavery in Maryland, he became a national leader of the abolitionist movements in Massachusetts and New York, famous for his oratory and incisive anti-slavery writings. Accordingly, he was described by abolitionists of his time as a living counterexample to the slaveholders' arguments that slaves lacked the intellectual capacity to function as independent American citizens. As Jacobin noted in an article bearing his name, Douglass was an anti-slavery leader who devoted his life to seeking the forcible expropriation of property worth more than all of antebellum America's factories, railroads, and banks combined. But the truth is that Douglass's long political career was rife with contradiction. For half a century, he moved about outside agitation and mainstream political engagement, between pessimism in the depth of American racial oppression and an optimistic faith in struggle and progress, between a wary liberal individualism and a bolder embrace of utopian socialism, working-class struggle, and interracial labor organizing against the tremendous power of capital. While it's unclear whether Douglass was definitely a socialist, he fought alongside them to free the slaves and carried on in the socialist tradition of a march towards emancipation. Seeking clues from his writing, the Jacobin article notes, in both pieces, Douglass embraces the position held by many 18th and 19th century Americans, though remarkably few established Democrats today, that wealth has ever been the tool of the tyrant, the readiest means by which liberty is overthrown. He anticipates arguments that unbridled accumulation is simply a part of human nature. In fact, the mighty machine of capitalist society is an innovation which compels rather than reflects acquisitive behavior. And he rejects the idea that poverty is an unchangeable fact of social life. It is, rather, the consequence of wealth unduly accumulated. Douglass and Brown met in 1847 and wrote of meeting one another. Douglass wrote that Brown denounced slavery in look and language fierce and bitter, and though that slaveholders had forfeited their right to live, that the slaves had the right to gain their liberty in any way they could, did not believe that moral cessation would ever liberate the slave, or that political action would abolish the system. Brown had come to Douglass to convince him to expand the Underground Railroad into something more like a freedom superhighway. Douglass was not convinced the plan would work, but Brown still had a profound effect on him. He wrote, "While I continued to write and speak against slavery, I became all the less hopeful of its peaceful abolition. My utterances became more and more tinged by the color of this man's strong impressions." According to some, Brown's actions even helped incite the Civil War. In 1855, wealthy white slave owners tried some dirty tricks to make Kansas a slave state. When a small war broke out between the men paid to shift the election in favor of slavery and the abolitionists, Brown and his sons rode to Kansas and took a few of the men prisoner. As W.E.B. Du Bois writes in his biography of Brown, the captives were quickly led to the woods and surrounded. Brown raised his hand, and at the signal the victims were hacked to death with broadswords. Du Bois goes on, "To this day, men differ as to the effect of John Brown's blow. Some say it freed Kansas, while some say it plunged the land back into civil war. Truth lies in both statements. The blow freed Kansas by plunging it into civil war and compelling men to fight for freedom, which they had vainly hoped to gain by political expediency." 3 years later, and with a stockpile of weapons, Brown met with a group of like-minded abolitionists and declared the independence of the American slaves, stating that slaves are, and of right, ought to be as free and independent as the unchangeable law of God requires that all men shall be. This led to a raid on a federal armory in Harper's Ferry, and by now you know how that ended for him. John Brown's body lies moldering in the grave. His soul is marching on. From the song made popular in the Civil War. As Frederick Douglass later declared, if John Brown did not end the war that ended slavery, he did at least begin the war that ended slavery. Until this blow was struck, the prospect for freedom was dim, shadowy, and uncertain. Sarah Grimk may not have been an avowed socialist, even though she, like Brown, was alive when the Communist Manifesto was published. But she was an abolitionist along with her sisters and one of the first feminists and suffragettes. She persisted in her belief the fight for women's rights was important as the fight to abolish slavery. And although Sarah had the right to equip women for economic independence and for social usefulness, they continued to be attacked even by some abolitionists who considered their position extreme. Abolition of slavery was achieved in her lifetime, but the fight for feminism and the woman's right to vote would only bear fruit after her death. Her fight continues on and is championed by those women who would come after her. In her first oral arguments to the Supreme Court in 1973, Ruth Bader Ginsburg quoted Sarah, "I ask no favor for my sex. All I ask of our brethren is that they take their feet off our necks." The fight for women's suffrage brought a lot of notable female socialists to the front lines of activism, as further expression of their political agency beyond what they were fighting for at the ballot box. Charlotte Gilman famously wrote a column on suffrage for the people, and later published the semi-autobiographical The Yellow Wallpaper. However, her written body of work is much larger, with many volumes written on feminist issues relevant to her time. Nan Sloan's book, A Woman in the Room, recounts the stories of many of the female socialists within the suffrage movement. The book discusses how socialists like Margaret MacDonald, Margaret Bonfield, and Mary MacArthur would often, like Grimk, find themselves at odds with the less radical elements of the suffrage movement. Bonfield and MacArthur made objections on principle to a campaign that would still leave the vast majority of poor working-class people disenfranchised and denied the chance to use the political system to force change. Beyond just fighting for a woman's right to vote, socialists of the time were fighting for every American's right to freedom and emancipation. Eugene V. Debs started his political career as a labor organizer turned Democrat who earned the esteem of Democratic and Republican newspapers alike for his forward thinking. In 1888, Debs wrote, "The strike is the weapon of the oppressed." The Pullman train strike he organized in 1894 was one of the single biggest labor actions in American history, stalling trains in 27 states. The rest of his story would unfold in the following century, as socialists all over the country began to take political power into their own hands for the first time. If you are still watching the video at this point, I'd like to take the time to ask you to check out the following channels, which, like my own, have not reached 1,000 subscribers yet. And if you're not subscribed to this channel, hit that button, ring that bell, do the YouTube stuff. And in an effort to keep this channel ad-free into the future, I would also ask that if you appreciate the content I'm putting out here, that you could go over to my Patreon, or even for a one-time donation, my Ko-fi page, and send me a little bit of money to help me make ends meet in a year that has been troubling the hell out of everyone.